We are gathered here and now. For a moment, we've stopped working, studying, and doing dishes. There are no tasks, no emails, no phone calls. We are gathered to feel closer to each other, to feel closer to ourselves, to feel closer to our deepest inspiration. The stream of life that runs through our body and runs through the world. May we be open to see and hear in each other what our soul wants to say. We light this chalice to symbolize our living tradition. Let this flame symbolize our passion to bring our faith into action. Let this flame symbolize our commitment to bring our prophetic voice to the people. May this, our passion and commitment, serve to advance human rights and social justice around the world, so that all may live in the spirit of light and love. Join me as together we remind ourselves of the affirmation that is a cornerstone of our free faith tradition. The words, should you need them, will be on the screen. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth and freedom, and to help one another. This is a congregation that gathers in faith, not faith in one religion or one God or any one way. We gather in faith of the power of diversity, the power of love, and the hope of a world transformed by our care. We gather in faith in ourselves and in those around us, not a faith that requires perfection or rightness in one another, rather a faith that in our shared imperfection we may learn to stumble and fall together. Faith that will help one another to rise and to try again and again. We are Unitarian Universalists.
This song that we're about to learn is a song that's entitled, Somebody's Hurting My Brother. Now, this song was actually born in a town hall meeting around coal ash. And the meeting came about because Duke Energy was spilling coal ash into poor black and brown and poor white neighborhoods. After hearing testimony after testimony of people who were impacted physically and mentally by the coal ash, this song came as an inspiration of those testimonies. So I'll call to you, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on, and your response is, far too long. Yes, it's gone on.
Far too long.
It's gone on.
Far too long.
Somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on.
Far too long.
Now the end is, and we won't be silent anymore. We'll say that together.
And we won't be silent anymore.
Okay? And so we'll try the rehearsal version, which goes, oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on
Far too long.
Yes, it's gone on
Far too long.
I tell you it's gone on
Far too long.
Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on
Far too long.
Together,
And we won't be silent anymore.
Now we're going to put a little rhythm to this, okay? Okay? But we're going to speed it up just a little bit. Not too fast. Ready?
The UU at UN has held a prominent place in the UN since 1962, advocating for our UU values on the global stage. Within our lifelong quest for a world community with peace and liberty and justice for all, the UU office at the United Nations is one way that we are getting closer to that goal. By engaging every day with member states and agencies and speaking out in defense of human rights for those who are oppressed, the UU office at the United Nations advocacy made sexual orientation and gender identity human rights a priority throughout the United Nations system. The UU at UN uses its affiliation with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to bring representatives of Unitarian Universalists to speak for our values at UN climate conferences. This year, the office is focused on bringing the global community together to share solutions for demilitarizing local police forces to amplify just and inclusive ways to keep communities safe. At a time when nationalism is so dominant around the world, having our UU voice represented at the UN is more critical than ever, and the UU at UN relies on congregational and individual donations to continue its work. I lift my eyes up to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from love abundant. My help comes from the hills. My help, it comes from ancient mothers whose hearts beat in mine. It comes from the trees that sway and the breeze that sways them. My help comes from all that was and is and will ever be. I lift my eyes, hushed by the soothing touch of waves, caressing wounded shores, wounded souls. I lift my eyes to the horizon bathed by the hum of mothers and mothers' mothers, cradling, gently rocking. I lift my voice, call of the sea trees, sister moon, mother earth, my soul weeping, a symphony of life overflowing. I give myself, I too hum through every pore, with every breath. I give myself an extension of all that is, was, and ever will be. I am a guest here in this house. Are you? Are we guests here in this house? And whose house do we inhabit? In the small world of our lives, the borders between us, easements, fences, gates, hedges, serve to delineate, to separate us, to remind us of where my property begins and ends, where your property begins and ends. If you cross over, you are a trespasser or a guest in my house. You've worked to own this small plot of land and the house erected on it. You've claimed it. It is now part of yourself, your definition of self, your identity. If I cross over your fences, I am a trespasser or a guest in your house. What does it mean then that in 1845, the United States crossed over into Mexico and took half the country, took land, resources, labor, was a U.S. trespasser, guest? Should we simply forget whose house we inhabit? To speak of hospitality in immigration often erases historical content, the actions of the past that have led us step by step into this current predicament. Professor Miguel de la Torre writes, "Perhaps it might be more accurate to speak of the responsibility of restitution rather than the virtue of hospitality. Hospitality in this case implies that the house belongs to us, that the land, the resources that are a part of this house is ours, and we who now live here are being virtuous in our willingness to share. It erases the history that would have us remember that those who cross the border today, those choosing to brave the harsh conditions of the desert, those who face the possibility of death, imprisonment, deportation, criminalization, are doing so because the U.S. once crossed their borders to extract their resources and labor. It is for them a matter of survival. It is for the U.S. a matter of restitution. The prospect of restitution is scary. Where do we begin? With Mexico? With Native Americans? With territories? With the descendants of those who were enslaved? How do we acknowledge and address the complexities of our history, present and, if we're not conscious, future of dominance? What would right relationship look like? What conditions and considerations would make restitution possible? And for us Unitarian Universalists, what would it mean for us to shake off the idea of hospitality as a central principle that is often attached to immigration and delve into the concept of restitution? Whose house do we inhabit? For we are not hosts, we are not owners, nor are we guests. What then is our responsibility?
Hello, I'm Bruce Knotts, Director of the Unitarian Universalist Association Office at the United Nations. We work in collaboration with the Canadian Unitarian Council. I'm delighted to be with. They say when all you get is lemons, make lemonade. As we can't be together in person, this is a great alternative. It also allows us to be in more places and connect with more of you without the cost and trouble of travel and accommodations. So this lemonade isn't so bad. Bob Woodward just came out with a new book on President Trump entitled Rage, where Trump made it clear to the author that he knew exactly how bad the pandemic would be, but he purposely minimized the danger so as not to panic the American people, he said. I love history. I have read and watched countless accounts of Winston Churchill. During his life and subsequently, much has been made of Churchill's faults and abilities. He had large measures of both, which makes him attractive to study. However, without a doubt, he alone gave Great Britain the leadership it needed to confront the Nazi fascist coalition which conquered most of Europe, but not Great Britain. He led the British in their finest hour. Churchill took a very different road from Donald. Instead of hiding the gravity of the crisis, he told the British people that all he had to offer was blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The message called on the British people to sacrifice and work together to face a terrible foe that could only be defeated with unified resolve, sacrifice, and hard work of everyone in the country and beyond. We are at that moment again, and I'm not going to sugarcoat what's in front of us. We have known about climate change for over 50 years. We have done nothing, and even today our government is doing nothing as fires consume the West, as coastal communities are being inundated, and other areas face unprecedented droughts. Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter warned us about climate change. Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House, and Reagan removed them. Meanwhile, all this time, massive government subsidies continue to flow to fossil fuel companies, even as we speak today and for all the decades past. At this time, we cut funding to all scientific research and development. Alternative forms of energy research and development has also been starved of funding. In December 1997, 150 countries met and adopted the Kyoto Protocols to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. The U.S. refused to join. When I was the regional refugee coordinator for the U.S. government in West Africa, Republican Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, who was at the time the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, visited and wanted to see refugee camps in the region. I was his guide. Everyone in the U.S. Embassy at Abidjan was laughing at the prospect of the progressive Bruce Knotts spending 2 weeks in refugee camps with the very conservative Jim Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin. We visited refugee camps crowded with 40,000 or more African refugees. Sensenbrenner asked in a panic, "How are we going to keep these people from coming to the United States?" My response was, "Easy. Take care of them where they are, with decent housing, schools, jobs, and necessities for a dignified life." As we bounced around African back roads to get to the camps, Jim Sensenbrenner regaled me with his stories of how he single-handedly kept the United States out of the Kyoto Protocols. He told me repeatedly how unfair the Kyoto Protocols were to the United States. This is the crux of my message today. The matter of fairness continues to arise when it comes to climate change. It is the major sticking point to progress. The genius of the Paris Climate Accords was that each nation came with their own best plan to combat climate change and then signed the agreement obligating their nation to fulfill the commitments they themselves had devised for their own country. And still we are failing. Trump continues to subsidize oil companies and to starve all other scientific research and development, including that for sustainable forms of energy. And he has withdrawn the USA from the Paris Climate Accords. India was also very vocal in Paris, saying that it was unfair for the West to have created vast wealth and infrastructure using fossil fuels only to ask developing countries such as India to reduce use of fossil fuels. Again, the issue of fairness and equity raised its head. If the agreement was unfair to India, then the world must continue to suffer climate change. New Delhi is the most polluted city in the world, impairing the health of millions of its citizens. It also compromises India's ability to combat COVID-19. India has the second highest death rate, overtaking Brazil and second only to the United States in deaths per million from the pandemic. A colleague of mine had a medical exam in India, and the doctor told her to quit smoking. She responded that she didn't smoke. The doctor said, "Then what is that stuff in your lungs?" And she responded, "That's India in my lungs." We all suffer from climate change. The only fair answer is for us all to work together to face this crisis. Fact: human beings are migratory, just as are Canadian geese, elephants, whales, and many other species on this planet. People will move if living conditions are intolerable where they are. So, what are the courses before us? We've waited too long to combat climate change. The clock has run out. All we can do now is try to adapt and mitigate. One thing people will do is migrate. Walls and violence will slow the migration, and thousands will die. Perhaps millions or billions of people will die in the process, but the migration will continue. For the past more than 50 years, the world community has done next to nothing, mostly on the pretext that any deal will appear unfair to one nation or another. If human beings are by nature migratory, we are also by nature adverse to global cooperation. We have managed all these thousands of years to exist being tribes, races, nations, religions, and divided in every way imaginable. Today, we are divided between those who will wear a mask to protect themselves and others, and those who insist that it is their constitutional right not to wear a mask. FYI, I have read the U.S. Constitution from beginning to end, and there is no such right not to wear a mask to protect yourself and others. Nonetheless, we have a mask-wearing tribe, and we have a "I don't care about your health or mine, and I won't wear a mask" tribe. While no group of people can agree on anything for long, we all seem destined to divide one way or another. However, there is an ancient and vast segment of humanity that, while divided amongst themselves, are united in their relation to the planet. Indigenous peoples are divided into groups and tribes, but united in their respect for the planet and the planet's systems. Wherever they live in harmony with nature and environment. They are the best teachers and guides to living gently on the earth. Some Eastern religions also point the way to a more sustainable forms of living and eating. The United Nations has told us that it is vital for us to have vastly increased areas on the Earth's surface covered with natural forests. Forests are the lungs of the Earth. They clean the air of pollutants. Unfortunately, we are burning forests and giving more land over to cattle raising. The United Nations said that we must change what we eat. We must adopt a more plant-based diet if we are to survive. We Unitarian Universalists have a workable answer. It is the 2011 Sustainable Statement of Conscience on Ethical Eating, Food and Environmental Justice. It begins, quote, "Aware of our interdependence, we acknowledge that eating ethically requires us to be mindful of the miracle of life we share with all beings. With gratitude for the food we have received, we strive to choose foods that minimize harm and are protective of the environment, consumers, farmers, and all those involved in food production and distribution, unquote. I encourage you to read the entire document, but I'll quote a few more lines. Access to adequate supply of healthy food and clean water is a basic human need and right. Many people do not have adequate food while others have a surplus. Minimally processed plant-based diets are healthier diets. We encourage a knowledgeable food choice based on understanding the demands of feeding a growing world population, unquote. The following year, 2012, the UUA General Assembly passed a responsive resolution. Quote, we, the delegates of the 2012 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association, repudiate the doctrine of discovery as a relic of colonialism, feudalism, and religious, cultural, and racial biases having no place in the modern treatment of indigenous peoples, and we call on the United States to fully implement the standards of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in U.S. law and policy without qualifications, unquote. I encourage you to read the entire UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted in 2007. Here are but a few provisions. Quote, affirming that indigenous peoples are equal to all others and recognizing the rights of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, to be respected as such, affirming that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind, affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Article 7. Indigenous individuals have the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. 2. Indigenous peoples have a collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples and shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children from the group to another group. Article 10. Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation where possible, with an option to return, unquote. UN DRIP, as the UN Declaration is called, has 46 articles, of which I've read only 2. There is much to learn and absorb. I hope you take the time to do so. How should we think of indigenous peoples? Most progressive people see indigenous people as among those on the planet who have been abused and wrongfully treated, and much more. All of this is true. However, I ask you to think of indigenous peoples in a different way. Think of them as the teachers that we desperately need in this frightening time of climate change. Indigenous peoples hunt for food and supplies, grow crops, gather food, and other materials needed for life from nature. However, unlike the rest of us, they don't have a history of totally depleting resources. They gather what's needed while preserving resources for the future. The great buffalo herds of the American West provided most of what indigenous peoples needed, and these herds were never in danger of extinction. It was the U.S. government that ordered the extinction of the buffalo in order to starve indigenous people to death so white people could steal indigenous land more easily. All modern civilizations, East and West, have lost their ability to live sustainably on the planet. When once meat was eaten for special occasions like Thanksgiving, weddings, Chinese New Year's, now all over the world, everyone seems to feel entitled to eat large quantities of beef and other meats 3 or more times every day, to the point that we're killing the planet with our eating habits. In 2020, the Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations, working in collaboration with the Canadian Unitarian Council, hosted our spring seminar on the topic of climate justice virtually, with a focus on Indigenous peoples. In 2021, we will host a seminar again on the topic of climate justice with a focus on food equity. While the virtual seminar deprives us of in-person contact, it gives us the ability to reach participants and invite speakers from around the world without the cost of travel to New York City. We are able this year and will be able next year to obtain live speakers from around the world, including amazing youth speakers such as the speakers we had this year from the Philippines, Scotland, Canada, and elsewhere. With more experience and more time to prepare in 2021, our seminar will be even better. We continue to engage the United Nations in virtual meetings with the permanent representatives of all of the members of the UN Security Council, with high-level UN diplomats for other member states, and with NGO leaders and from both faith-based and secular organizations. While we work virtually, our work is not free. We continue to need your support to be able to promote our values at the United Nations, and importantly, to learn and transmit back to you the experience and wisdom of the entire world that meets and works at the United Nations to ensure that we have a sustainable, peaceful, and just world for ourselves and those who come after us. Please support this important and vital work. Thank you.
The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. This land is holy, and so are we. This land is holy, and so are we. is holy, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The sun is shining, and so are we. The sun is shining, and so are we. The sun is shining, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be.
We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are not perfect, but we are perfectly fitted for this day. We are not without fault. But we can be honest to face our past as we chart a new future. We are the ones we have been waiting for. May we be bold and courageous to chart that new future. May we have faith in a future that is not known. We are the ones we have been waiting for. Please join me in saying the words to extinguish our chalice. The words are on the screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
When the pandemic of 2020 struck, all the local churches emptied out, as if we were all kicked out of the garden again. And the people had to worship in the virtual world. But the people have made their way, and seekers and sinners alike. So join us on November 1st, when all the saints will gather and all the souls will be honored, because we have now all become one congregation, the congregation of the real world. Everyone will return to their home church eventually. But meanwhile, join me here on November 1st, and we'll talk about how it's the congregation of the real world that is going to transform the future. Hope I see you then.